Thank you. So yes, I am going to talk to you about human rights and digital freedoms, or human rights in the digital society. And I can tell you from the beginning that I am going to give you a lot more questions than answers. I'm actually not sure I'm going to give you any answers, but lots of questions or challenges. Another thing that I wanted to say from the outstart is that I am not going to talk about the GDPR. Actually, I will. I'm talking about it right now, and I am going to keep talking about why I'm telling you I'm not going to talk about it. If anybody miraculously has avoided finding out what the GDPR is, this is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the EU's new regulation that entered into force literally now. There are a few different reasons why I'm mentioning why this is not my topic. One practical one is that the other session following from this one is devoted exactly to the GDPR. But more importantly than that, there are some, let's say, more philosophical or profound reasons why I don't wish to make that the key of my presentation. It is definitely not that it isn't important, it's hugely important. It's just that it's just a very small part of what is the legal situation in the digital society. When I work on e-governance in different parts of the world, all over the world actually, very often hear that there are legal obstacles. I would actually say there are no legal obstacles. There is no such thing as legal obstacles to e-governance, apart from those that may follow from human rights principles. Constitutional principles, if you wish. Human rights are normally included in the constitutions of countries. But apart from that, there are no legal obstacles. The reason for mentioning that is that very many people, whether lawyers or non-lawyers, do not make the distinction between what admittedly most lawyers work on, which is applying law, working as advocates, as lawyers, and creating law. I know that it's politicians who actually make law, not lawyers, but in every country around the world it's legally trained people who draft legislation, who make these proposals. So if you cannot implement digital solutions, solutions of e-governance or something else, you change the law. Because there are very few, if any, obstacles, I would say, that follow from human rights. Even if there would appear to be such obstacles, I think then it's more a question of doing something differently, rather than not being able to do it digitally. But if there is a legal obstacle for the use of, say, electronic documents or something, all you do is you rewrite the law. That is the way to tackle it. So, as I say, the legal obstacle is an excuse or maybe a misunderstanding in not knowing how to deal with the issues, not involving people with the legal knowledge perhaps early enough in creating a digital society. As a very brief sort of personal parenthesis, the other topic that I work on, apart from the cyber world, cyberspace, is outer space, the law of outer space. It's quite popular, I'm far from the only one, to compare these two spaces. And there are a number of reasons for that. For example, in both of these areas, we have no clear national borders, or rather activities can easily ignore the national borders, which raises issues of jurisdiction that I will come back to a bit later on as well. But there's another similarity that I was struck by when I was reading especially the early literature on either of these spaces, outer space or cyberspace. And that is this romantic notion early on of now we're creating something entirely new. Now we're moving away from the shackles of the earth and we're going to start from a clean slate, a blank sheet of paper. So we don't have to care about anything the way it's been done on earth. This hasn't worked out. both outer space use and cyberspace are now old enough, so we know it doesn't work like that. One can discuss that almost philosophically. It would be too long to discuss here why that is the case, if it is because human beings cannot think innovatively enough, or if it perhaps is that the kind of legal structures we have are the ones that naturally follow if people want to live together peacefully or so. Could be different reasons, but the point is that what happens after a while is that this romantic notion disappears, or fades at least, and instead comes the question, so how to make sense of the rules, the laws that we have, the human rights in this new environment. And this is really the challenge for the human rights in the digital society. We don't need to create any new rights, and we can also not say that the rights that exist aren't suitable. We just have to see how would they be suitable now when the structure around them is so different. And in this work, one of the issues, it's too strong to call it maybe a problem, but let's say an issue or a challenge, is an obsession with quantification. To come back to my initial comment that I'm not going to talk about the GDPR, and I said I'm going to keep mentioning why not, I think this, if we can call it obsession with GDPR as well, is because that fits into what people think should be the legal situation for the cyber world. A clear legal act which tells you can do this and you cannot do that, and you have to do it this way and not that way. This is how both lawyers who don't deal with cyber issues and non-lawyers think the legal situation of the cyber world would be, because this very fluid and hard to grasp and vague character of it is much more complex and very poorly suited for quantification. What do I mean by this obsession with quantification? Well, we have, which is a good thing, we have a lot more interdisciplinarity, whether in the academic sense at universities or in the professional sense, that we almost, regardless of what we work on, if it's in any way tied to the cyber world, we find that we have to deal with various issues, technological issues, sociological issues, questions of digital literacy, various things. We don't have anymore these clear lines between different parts of the task where we would just ask other people to deal with what is not our specialization, but we tend to have to deal with it much more ourselves. And somehow, and not surprisingly, maybe in the cyber world, the kind of IT thinking predominates. It tends to be the strongest. It is based, I mean, the whole word, digitalization, digits, numbers. But when it comes to human rights issues, ethical issues, moral issues, they just don't fit in that. It is not possible to say clearly what applies in one sense or another, because the questions in the human rights sphere are almost always a question of weighing different rights against one another. There are no absolute human rights. Human rights have exceptions, and these can be because they might conflict with another human right, or they might conflict with the same human right for another person. So the question that people who deal with human rights, not only lawyers, have to deal with is how do we then make this evaluation? How do we weigh these different things? How do we balance them in this particular case? And it depends on so many circumstances. I'm not saying artificial intelligence will never be able to do this, because artificial intelligence develops all the time, but I'm definitely saying it's going to take a long time from the level of artificial intelligence today, and it's going to be maybe one of the last things where robots are actually going to be able to do this better than humans, simply because this is, say, something where it is very difficult to quantify what you're doing. I mean, you cannot say that through this measure we made 27% of people 62% less corrupt, for instance. It would be nonsense, because that isn't the way you can measure things. And there is a specific danger with this obsession with quantification, that is that one thing that you can, of course, quantify is you have adopted another law, or you've adopted more regulations. So there is a temptation to keep adopting laws, adopting regulations, decisions, because then you can tick boxes and say, look, we did so much. Here is a number we can show you. And that, I think, in almost all cases is a very bad idea when it comes to the situation for human rights in the digital world. Now in the sort of, let's say, almost middle of my presentation, it makes sense to stop a little bit to say, what are human rights? I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with that, but still it may make sense to say a few words about the nature of them to help understand the challenges. Human rights are rights that we all have because we are human. So where they come from, again, a topic one could spend hours on in a philosophical discussion. Do they follow from nature? Do they have anything to do with religion? Or whatever different theories exist, but what is agreed upon is that these are rights that are universal, although they can be interpreted differently. Also, unfortunately, it varies a lot whether countries implement them or not, but the rights as such are based on a universal understanding of rights we have because we're humans. And the rights are mainly towards the state. So these are rights that individuals have vis-à-vis the state and its various organs, that states, through their different organs and sub-organs, should not violate these rights. In addition, however, one human right that's included in this package is that the state should provide guarantees that human rights of individuals aren't violated by other individuals. So you should have a way to seek a legal remedy. You should be able to turn somewhere in order to get some help with possible violations of your human rights. But it's mainly the state that is the key actor in protecting these rights. The rights are usually stipulated in constitutions, international conventions that may or may not be directly included into these constitutions, but also, of course, specific legislation, such as data protection legislation, to make sense of these rights in a more specific way. That does not solve this balancing issue. So that is why I'm saying that adopting new laws is not solving the questions we have to deal with, and can be harmful. For instance, I'll mention a few different examples of what I mean with these rather sort of obscure, intriguing questions on the slide as well. Fake news is a bad thing. So what is fake news? I'm not trying to make some kind of, like, say, postmodernist statement, there is no such thing as truth. I actually don't believe that. I think we can argue, again, it's a philosophical issue, but yes, there are things that are more true than other things. So. But it's one thing to know in this kind of debate way also what we mean with it. It's another way of knowing it in a normative way that's good enough to make a court case about it. So legislation against fake news opens up a huge possibility for abuse. For politicians, for instance, to claim that investigation into corruption is fake news, something like that. Still, we have a law on fake news, I think the first in the world, just adopted last month in Malaysia. And we have both in France and in the UK commissions tasked with investigating, making legislation on fake news. These are countries with protection of freedom of expression. These are rule of law countries. I'm not even talking of the countries where we lack rule of law and democracy anyway. So it's a temptation to solve a difficult issue through legislation. Another such temptation to solve something through legislation is the law from the German law adopted last year, entered into full force 1st of January this year, which can fine big internet platforms. It has to be at least 2 million users, so these are targeted at the really big ones, with fines up to 50 million euros if they do not remove illegal content within a short period. Admittedly, this law does not make content illegal. That has to be based on other legislation. So it can be things like incitement to hatred and violence, or Holocaust denial, or things like that are illegal under other laws in Germany. But still, think of the chilling effect of such a law, that if you are afraid that you may be subject to a fine of such magnitude, it may be very tempting to just remove the content if you are looking at this delicate balance, or is it not illegal? At the same time, the question definitely with human rights in the digital society is how to actually enforce and implement them. So that's why I'm not actually saying that less law is always better than more, because you do need to have something based on which decisions can be taken. It is just a fallacy to think that you can sort of write away these problems that may arise. That is not possible, because the balancing must still be there. But definitely we must think about the question of how to be able to implement and how to be able to enforce in an entirely new situation. Namely, the question of the actual power to enforce decisions. You may be aware of a referendum held on Friday in Ireland about abortion, and leading up to this referendum, Google decided that they would not allow political adverts from any side in this referendum debate. This is not violating human rights. I think Google is a private company. They can decide how to do business with some restrictions that may follow from competition law and things like that. I'm not saying whether it's a good or bad decision either. I'm actually just telling you about this, that you probably have heard about anyway, and telling you about it because to show that this is what now is the most important in the discussion of who does what in a sort of democratic discussion. So it's actually the action of private companies. Always, I mean, there's nothing new actually, again, with having private companies, private subjects, and the companies could even be individuals, but private subjects having an important role in enforcement of laws of different kind, including human rights. But what is new is the power that these companies have, just how big they are and how much their decisions matter. So if a company like Google decides to not have political adverts in this campaign, that changes the nature of this campaign. So it definitely affects very strongly the democratic landscape we're operating in, simply because of their power, their magnitude. The problem with these very big companies, these platforms that encompass so many things, is that they are, of course, they are subjects of some jurisdiction because they are based in a country or several, and they can be that way found, and without being too legalistic, but I'm sure you will know, even if you are not lawyers, but there are different ways in which countries can exercise jurisdiction. So the simplest is things that go on its territory, to some extent with its citizens, but there can also be various other ways of sort of catching subjects and exercising jurisdiction. But they all rely on the fact of this being sort of physically and practically possible, that you actually have an effect. And there, in such a case, for companies of this magnitude, it's very difficult to see what way there could be of exercising effective jurisdiction. Because there is another thing that is new in the digital world, and that is how easy it is to move without this being noticeable. Again, it's not entirely new that you could choose a jurisdiction, even if the legislation doesn't exactly expect you to do that. But one famous example I'm sure everybody's heard of is flags of convenience from the shipping industry, where companies decide to register vessels in a jurisdiction that is suitable for them to avoid more onerous obligations in another jurisdiction. We also have things existing for a while that ignore borders, like direct broadcasting satellites, for instance. But with all of these examples, and also with the simple fact of people moving to another country for various reasons, or tax havens, another such example, they always included something that you had to do, like you had to move yourself, or you had to move the operations of your company or something, and it was a bit complicated. Now in the digital world, your customers or users often have no idea where you are based. It actually matters not at all, because you can just move your operations. So avoiding jurisdictions that aren't suitable has become a lot more simple, a lot more possible. Another thing is not just avoiding jurisdictions in the sense of physically, like going to another jurisdiction. And maybe I should say, as again, I'm sure most of you here know it, but which perhaps sometimes, let's say, ordinary people wouldn't know, is that, of course, it is a little bit less anonymous and not tied to a country, what you do in the internet, than what people maybe think, because IP addresses, you can see where they come from. And so some people may think that just by changing, your email address, so you will become you will disappear from a certain jurisdiction. It's not that easy, but it is still very easy to find ways of avoiding something. In addition to going to another jurisdiction, there is something else that is actually easier in the digital world, and that is going to the criminal side of the world, the dark web, as it is. Again, I'm not talking about something that's entirely new. Historical example would be all the bootlegged alcohol during Prohibition, things like that. Again, many examples. One can look at various issues where if something becomes illegal, if there is enough pressure to still have that something, whether it's a product or a service, so ways will sort of come up to still have it. But again, that is something a bit complicated. I mean, if I wanted to set up a chapter of the mafia in Estonia, for instance, I wouldn't have a clue how to go about it. I wouldn't know the first thing, how do I find criminal people to do criminal activities? But if it was a question of going to the dark web, I think even I could figure it out after sort of some investigation. So again, it is much easier to move away from jurisdiction than it is in the non-cyber world. This actually can already be seen to some extent, because when the big platforms like Facebook and YouTube and so have become stricter in enforcing certain rules of ethics and other such things, it has been seen. I don't have any numbers, it's been more an anecdotal evidence, but it's mentioned by many, how more activity is actually moving to various platforms in the dark web. Different sort of racist, homophobic speech, for instance, and things like that. They find their own platform somewhere else. This is always a dilemma, because it's not a solution, something I would suggest, to then not make rules and say, well, if we make rules, people will just avoid them anyway. That clearly isn't the solution. This is more, and I said in the beginning, I'm not providing you with answers, I'm rather providing you with questions or challenges. But this is something to be kept in mind, because there is also no point in making rules if they can just be avoided. So there needs to be a certain balance in which there is at least an expectation to a large extent rules will be followed for them to have any sense at all. And that brings me to the point, the slide as well, with the self-regulation. Self-regulation is a term that's used in different ways. One meaning of it would be just that individuals, but mainly we talk of legal persons, companies, regulate themselves in the sense that they behave in a certain way because it is good or because there is pressure on them to do so, so that they do not commit violations simply through their own decisions. But the other understanding of the word self-regulation is that you create systems of self-regulation. So you have a kind of jury by your peers. You have a system in which entities come together and make rules and make sure that others themselves and others follow these rules. Like many things I mentioned, it's not new because of the cyber world. Here we see the sort of legal history of this, for instance, from the printed press, where very many countries that do have freedom of expression and a free press, for decades already have had self-regulatory systems. So there's been very few laws about press, and the courts very rarely get involved in cases about the press, but instead there are systems created by the press, the industry itself, that creates codes of practice, systems for enforcing them, and so. It's nothing new, but it's taken off and become more popular because of the cyber world. And I think the main reason for this is that it is simply so difficult to know what else to do because of the ease with which we can ignore borders, the ease with which one can decide to go to another jurisdiction, and also with this fluidity of the balance between different rights. So this has led to a lot of these different multi-stakeholder fora that I'm sure many of you have been in different ways involved in, which include not just companies, but also countries, NGOs, international, intergovernmental organizations, to try to create rules and also systems for monitoring and applying them. This is a very good idea because it can definitely deal with some of the challenges that I mentioned. For instance, this about certain companies being too big to be really scared enough of any country's jurisdiction. If they are within this system and helping to create these rules, they have a say in it. Yes, maybe some of the rules are a bit more shaped to what they like than what it would be if they were made by entire outsiders as traditional law. But on the other hand, that may mean that they actually make more of an effort to follow them. And we've seen such positive examples from press self-regulation, although we've also seen examples of press regulation collapsing. So it's not a sort of sure thing that it will work. It also helps to deal with the question of the jurisdiction between countries because of this international way of bringing everybody in. So if you agree on these different rules, then also on systems for monitoring them, it matters less that one country may have difficulty in enforcing its rules. But as the topic for this talk is human rights, I would say self-regulation would be difficult to say it was enough, or it would be a huge step at least to say that we leave even human rights enforcement to just self-regulation. As I mentioned, the nature of human rights is that these are the key rights that we all have, that the state should make sure that it does not violate, and the state should ensure that we get protection if somebody else tries to violate them. So to just leave this to self-regulation would be in a way to give up, or to say that we can no longer actually guarantee your human rights because we now have these new players in the cyber world that are too powerful, so you have to rely on them providing you with protection for your rights. Which maybe at some point has to happen, but at least will be a huge step. So again, I repeat, I would be happy if I could give you an answer how to deal with this, but I would say that this self-regulatory systems, different multi-stakeholder bodies, and so they are really great ideas, and they should be encouraged and participated in, But states should not forget that they do still have a responsibility, and this responsibility to a large extent is, again, this weighing, providing a system through the courts, and so when your rights are violated, to try to balance what is more important than the freedom of expression or the protection of data. Freedom of expression, protection of life, even when we're talking of laws of incitement to hatred and violence. Things are not always perhaps as bad as they may sound from what I've been saying, like it's all sort of pointless to try to do anything, because one of my reasons for advocating not adopting lots of legislation is that legislation often actually already exists, and I just mentioned a couple of examples. We have protection of privacy legislation, data protection or other protection of privacy. We have legislation against incitement to hatred and violence. We have legislation against libel and slander. So there are a number of different laws that exist and can be applied. So not adopting new ones doesn't mean not using the legal system. It just means if we have problems enforcing the existing legislation, what's the point of just keep adopting new laws? It's not going to be any easier to adopt another law and to implement, another law than the ones that already exist. So a balance between the self-regulatory systems and the actual traditional legal system. And I'm going to end up on positive notes. It doesn't look particularly positive, these images here, but I will explain what I mean. I mean positive things provided by the cyber world. The orange poster there, it's something I took a picture of at Frankfurt Airport just a couple of days ago, and it says in German, then it says, "Watch out, human rights." And it's a campaign run by the German ministry together with the Organization for Human Rights. You can probably not really see all the text, but what it points out is that there are, for instance, and you see the mobile phone, is the child labor? Are there workers' rights accepted? What about environmental rights and so on? What I'm showing you, it's a nice campaign. I mean, making people aware of human rights in its broad context, because we do, if we include in human rights, we can include not just political and civil rights, but also what's called by human rights lawyers second-generation rights, so social and economic rights, which includes then workers' rights, etc. But child labor and things like that are often actually even against the political and civil rights. To make people aware that as consumers, as users, as individuals, we actually have a lot of opportunities thanks to the way we can much more easily communicate globally, and we can make campaigns and so to put pressure. And this we have seen concrete examples of. Apple, a couple of years ago, it was discovered that they had there was child labor used among several of their suppliers in different countries. This created a lot of media attention and put a lot of pressure on Apple. It also helps that Apple, like many of these other sort of high-tech companies, they have a kind of image, or they want to have an image of being respectful of human rights and of being sort of liberal. And so they cannot ignore such things. Cobalt is a very important material used in the batteries of mobile phones. And there have been horrific evidence of the conditions in cobalt mines in different countries, with child labor of children as young as 5 years working in conditions that aren't fit for animals to work in. Again, when this comes out, if this is then used in the social media context, it cannot be ignored. So it is a tool of empowerment, of forcing governments to do something in a way where we see the positive effect of the cyber world, bringing attention to human rights in a way that was not really possible in this forceful way before. And the image there on the side of it, this is United Airlines treating its passengers even a little bit worse than they usually do. I'm sure you will have seen that image. And this, maybe it's more, say, consumer empowerment than empowerment in the human rights sense, but it's still an example of that this would have been a story even pre the internet era. But then, without people having cameras and smartphones, it would have been word against word. United Airlines would have tried to say it wasn't exactly what happened, etc. And so it wouldn't have spread with that kind of speed. And so yes, we can, if we use the possibilities that social media gives us, we can really use this for the benefit of supporting rights. And my very final point, just to leave you with the feeling that the digital revolution is wonderful. 2 small examples from opposite corners of the world. Estonia first. I have the benefit of being part in, say, a cultural group or so, consisting of mainly young performing artists. And I was attending a sort of focus group with these young performing artists of the more, say, alternative art scene type people who have nothing to do with e-governance as such and are not working in this area in any way. And we were discussing what freedom means for Estonians. And I was really struck by how important our e-governance was for these young people. And one girl put it perfectly. She said that the e-governance in Estonia, it shows that the government works for you and not the other way around. Because we do not have to go someplace at a time and place where it suits the government, but government comes to us. And this is, say, as a person who's not in any way involved in it, who's rather more of, say, an alternative lifestyle artist. And I thought that was perfectly put. So a well-functioning e-governance, it does that. And that is also human rights, because that supports the exercise of your rights, which is what the government is for. And then the other image at lady is called Teresa Katrin, and she's a chief in a region of Malawi, a very important chief, and she has run a campaign against child marriage for years since she became a chief. And she has managed to prevent or reverse several hundred child marriages. A very important human rights issue. She has been doing this through her personal the respect and power she has, and through a network of people who have given her information and helped inform her where there is somewhere where she should react and so on. But still, think of the way her work, or work like that, can be spread and get a much bigger impact when it is no longer just the word of mouth. And Malawi is a country with very low in mobile phone penetration, actually, but even there, it is now possible to get this word from village to village, and people can actually contribute to finding ways to react to human rights violations. So I will leave you with these hopefully positive thoughts on top of all the different challenges and hardly any answers, as I promised in the beginning. So thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Katrin.
I don't know if we have time for any questions.
We could sneak one in. Anyone? Oh, we go. Going, gone. Oh, here we are. So, of course, after I said gone, that's when it's time to put the hand up. Here you are.
Bloody quick, mate. That's what it is.
There was one in the back as well, actually. Yeah.
Oh, there we are. All right.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I was just wondering, when I think about human rights and the stuff, I was thinking of things like transparency. I mean, there's transparency before, but it dramatically changes it if it's done right. Could be done badly, and things like that. And what we've been discussing all day with democracy as well. Again, democracy didn't, of course, existed before, but it opens new possibilities. And these are all human rights in a sense. So, I mean, this is what I was assuming. I mean, is that something which you also can say yes to? I guess you're nodding, yeah?
I'm nodding, yes.
The other thing, the other question was, you talked about second generation rights, right? I suppose there must be first generation rights then. I was thinking of, I think in Finland a few years ago, they made internet access a human right as the first country. I guess Estonia has it as well, I don't know. But that is very specifically a human right based upon IT, right? Are there other examples like that you can think of, or which are important? To be concrete, yeah?
Yeah. Well, first, very briefly, I totally agree with what you first said, and that when I meant this, mentioning the Estonian e-governance, so exactly, transparency and all those things can be supported. So yes, it's a strong support for human rights. The question of the generations of human rights is something that is mainly used by sort of academics, people who talk about it. It's a little bit now perhaps challenged as well. We used to talk of political and civil rights, the traditional right to life and freedom of expression as a first generation, economic, social. Third generation were collective rights, like right to a clean environment, right to development and so on. And then there are people who like to talk of fourth generation rights, which would be rights specifically for the digital society. At the same time, this division has kind of maybe been becoming a bit less popular simply because so many of these things go into one another. So some people would say that the digital rights actually are either they are first generation, they're strengthening freedom of expression, or they are economic social rights. So I would say this categorization is less important. I think the right to internet is sort of a specific right. We could place it in whichever generation. Other than that, I don't really know what. I think the other rights that follow from the digital society tend to be more making existing rights more sophisticated, like the data protection, like the transparency or access to information, so rather than new rights as such. So.
Okay, I'm going to a lady up here.
Thank you. I will be quick. I like your comparison of the cyberspace with the outer space, and I'm curious to know your reflections about the new concept of digital sovereignty, or maybe not that new concept. Do you think it is something of interest and something which is really existing, or it's just an artificial construction that other countries are trying to build? Thank you.
Thanks for a very interesting question, which I have 0 seconds to answer, but I will do it anyway. I'm familiar with the concept. I'm very skeptical to it, to be brief, because sovereignty is challenged. Sovereignty, which means that each country can basically do what they like, has so many challenges even on Earth, because we are so interconnected. All countries, with maybe some very few examples, but have so many dealings with other countries, so it's actually impossible to do things without caring for all of these international networks anyway. I think adding digital sovereignty, and in those contexts where I've seen it mentioned, is usually something which actually either doesn't add anything, or tries to give a kind of a false sense of being able to do things without caring about others, which is even more difficult in the digital world. So I would say that this doesn't add anything, actually. It's an interesting concept to discuss, but in the end, it doesn't solve anything. And for instance, putting it in legislation, I've actually been advising on a number of laws where it has been suggested, and I've always suggested striking it out because it doesn't give anything.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Please, one more round of applause for Katrin.
Thank you.
Thank you.